The first and most crucial step is maintaining your emotional equilibrium. Your ability to stay grounded, even in the face of their intense emotions, is essential, not just for your well-being, but for helping them feel safe and contained. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. I'm excited to dive into today's topic on vulnerable narcissism. To set the stage, I want to review some key concepts that are crucial to understand if you're dealing with vulnerable narcissistic characteristics, either your own or perhaps someone close to you in your life. This conversation naturally builds on themes from my earlier episodes, where I explored the psychological roots of, and I quote, helplessness and how it shapes behavior. Additionally, in a live interview with Lisa Taylor Austin, I began unpacking the dynamics of relating to a vulnerable narcissist, introducing practical tools and techniques to manage these complex relationships. Let's jump right into it with a quick review of these foundational ideas before delving deeper into specific tools and strategies you can use to navigate either your own vulnerable narcissistic traits or relationships with individuals who display vulnerable narcissistic characteristics. What comes to mind when you think about vulnerable narcissism? For many, it's easy to imagine it as a recalcitrant, even untreatable condition, one where nobody truly gets better. This belief can make working with or relating to someone with these traits feel overwhelming or even hopeless. Just as a quick reminder, or a brief introduction for anyone who hasn't listened to our recent episodes, vulnerable narcissism is a subtype of narcissism characterized by a profound emotional fragility and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Like other subtypes, individuals with these traits struggle with a fragile self-esteem, hypersensitivity to criticism, and a desperate need for validation. However, their approach to seeking validation is unique. Unlike grandiose narcissists, who are overtly confident and self-assured, vulnerable narcissists are overtly insecure and emotionally exposed. Their demands for care, whether emotional, financial, or decision-making support, can manifest in behaviors like clinginess, sulking, or even desperation to maintain connections. While it's true that meaningful change can be challenging, it's far from impossible. With the right level of motivation, tools, and approach, progress is achievable. For those in a relationship with someone exhibiting these traits, it's essential to approach their emotional needs with patience and empathy. And I'll say more about that in a moment. At the same time, if you recognize aspects of these traits in yourself, this conversation will provide valuable insights and strategies to help you move toward healthier ways of relating to others and yourself. Let's explore this idea that progress is achievable and delve into approaches for fostering healthier dynamics. If, for instance, your goal is to maintain a relationship with the vulnerable narcissistic person in your life, you must neither attack, demand, nor withdraw. Instead, focus on helping them understand that their needs can be expressed in healthier ways without relying on dependency or manipulation. Before we dive into how to approach this, let's reflect on the core of the vulnerable narcissist neediness. In other words, what drives these behaviors and their struggles? If you're supporting someone who feels overly dependent, ask yourself, What are they truly seeking beneath their demands? If you see these traits in yourself, try to consider, what are you really looking for in those moments of seeking reassurance? What emotions are you trying to soothe or escape? At its core, the neediness of a vulnerable narcissist stems from a deep desire for someone who can make them feel safe, who's able to hold space for their anxieties and respond with emotional attunement without reacting with anger, annoyance, or frustration, even in the most challenging moments. When early expressions of need, such as smiles, cries, or pleas, were met with indifference or irritation, these individuals learned to doubt their ability to attract the care they sought. Instead of finding a caregiver who could soothe their distress, they were left to fend for themselves emotionally, often due to caregivers who were too stressed, preoccupied, or unavailable. Over time, this lack of support led to the development of omnipotent, demanding strategies to get their needs met. And this laid the groundwork for narcissistic relational patterns. Despite their desperate need for emotional attunement, they often come to view genuine vulnerability as dangerous. Of course they do, especially if they were over-frustrated early in life. Imagine a friend calling you late at night, crying about how unfairly they were treated at work. Instead of saying, "I felt so hurt and dismissed," they might vent, and I quote, "My boss is awful and never listens. I don't know how much more I can take." That's unquote. See, what I'm trying to capture here is this is the literal mode that I spoke about in earlier episodes. In this literal mode, the focus is on unloading their pain, expecting you to validate their feelings immediately with responses like, "Oh, that's terrible. You deserve better." Rather than engaging in a deeper dialogue to explore their emotions or their actions, they're just seeking reassurance. Okay. Now that we've described how vulnerable narcissism presents itself and explored one core dynamic behind it, let's get into exactly how to approach this in a way that fosters healthier dynamics. Step 1, if I can be overly schematic here. Choose your approach. In other words, how do you want to respond to this? To foster healthier dynamics with a vulnerable narcissist, the first and most crucial step is maintaining your emotional equilibrium. Your ability to stay grounded, even in the face of their intense emotions, is essential, not just for your well-being, but for helping them feel safe and contained. The first step is deciding on your approach. If you want to maintain a relationship and be helpful, as I mentioned earlier, you must neither attack, demand, nor withdraw. One approach is what I call imposing your will. In essence, this is the attack and demand mode, okay? This involves relying on power and control, forcing compliance through either physical actions, like for instance, you can, make a child, you could literally get them out of bed in the morning, right? Or you could use external motivators such as rewards and consequences. While this strategy might yield immediate results, it often comes at a cost. Over time, it undermines intrinsic motivation and can erode the already fragile self-esteem of vulnerable individuals, further entrenching their neediness and emotional dependency. Punitive measures like, and I quote, tough love, often backfire with vulnerable narcissists. When faced with external pressure through consequences, they become overwhelmed. These measures only escalate stress and worsen their behaviors, leading you to increase discipline and perpetuate the cycle. We have to admit it. We are and I quote again, tough love society. And many of us wrongly assume that making things harder will force change. But this approach misunderstands their behavior. Their clinging, demanding actions are compensatory coping mechanisms rooted in a need for what? We said it earlier. Remember the theory. Empathic attunement. That's what they're really looking for, but they just don't know how to express that need. Criticism, ultimatums, or cutting them down only deepens their feelings of being misunderstood and unsupported. This reinforces their helplessness and dependency, since that is the only way. Again, remember, in the demanding omnipotence, that's the only way that they think they could feel supported. This does not foster real growth or change. True lasting change happens when they feel loved and supported, not punished or threatened. So, if tough love and making demands doesn't work, I should just offer incentives and rewards instead. I'm so sorry to say, but that's the wrong answer. Offering incentives is another way to impose your will. Why? Because you're still trying to get them to do something. This approach might feel more positive, but it's still about external control. It doesn't address the root of the issue. Rewards and incentives only reinforce their dependency on external validation and fail to build the internal emotional strength they truly need for lasting growth. For those already struggling with internal regulation problems, this approach deepens their dependence and helplessness while hindering self-motivation. Also, efforts to motivate them often send an unintended or implicit message. You're not trying hard enough. This can strike at the core of their already fragile self-esteem. If you're the one receiving this kind of support, it might be helpful to reflect on how it leaves you feeling. Does it encourage growth, or does it deepen feelings of guilt, inadequacy, and helplessness? So, if tough love doesn't work and trying to incentivize them isn't helpful, what if I just drop my expectations and distance myself instead? I am constantly hearing online, this is you saying this, by the way, I am constantly hearing online that I should create, and I quote here, boundaries. What do you think about that? Okay, let me respond to that, okay? The problem with stepping back from your expectations is this approach doesn't directly address the issues, but it can help de-escalate conflict when too many demands are in play. This approach is much healthier than imposing your will with rewards and consequences. And by creating some space, it may position you for a better way forward. What if I told you that there is indeed a better way forward that is more effective and you can still maintain healthy boundaries? Instead of trying to motivate a vulnerable narcissist to change, to get out of bed, start exercising, or think independently, we need to shift the focus. Based on my experience working with these individuals, a more effective approach involves creating space for them to learn emotional regulation, build intrinsic motivation, and most importantly, understand the meaning of their helplessness. This requires working with their emotional vulnerabilities, not against them, and fostering curiosity and self-reflection rather than applying external pressure. This leads us to the concept of containment. Containment is an essential step in working with vulnerable narcissists. Once we shift the focus toward emotional growth, it's important to offer containment. Containment refers to providing a safe, supportive space where the vulnerable narcissist feels heard and understood without judgment. But what exactly is containment? And what does it look like in practice? Containment is essentially about holding space for someone's emotions in a way that helps them feel safe and understood rather than overwhelmed, forced, or judged. If I can use some psychoanalytic terminology here, and don't worry, I promise you I'll explain this in simple terms in just a moment. Containment is a process of metabolizing, detoxifying, and giving the projections back in a way that makes it easier for the person to think about and then internalize the emotions. Think of it this way. When someone shares something really heavy, like an intense fear or deep sadness, and when I say share it, I mean in a literal way again, that's the dumping and purging. It's like they're handing you an emotional hot potato. Containment is about being able to hold that hot potato, cool it down, and hand it back in a way that feels manageable. It's not about solving their problems for them. It's more like helping them make sense of their feelings without being consumed by them. This process starts early in life, where containment involves a caregiver helping the child label and manage their emotional experiences. By providing a safe space for the child to express and process emotions, the caregiver supports emotional regulation and helps the child feel understood and recognized. But remember what I said earlier when we applied a theory to why they present as helpless. These are the individuals who grow up with a caregiver who was preoccupied, depressed, or distant, or anxious. Think for a moment about your own childhood, or even the childhood of a vulnerable narcissist in your life. Did you or they have this kind of caregiver? For the vulnerable, helpless, and needy individual, the answer is most likely no. That absence of containment early on is precisely why the act of containment becomes so crucial and necessary in relationships with them. Since containment is key to healthy development, it's essential to fully understand what this process involves. There are several steps in the process of containment, and I want to introduce the first one now. We won't have time to dive into all the steps today, but don't worry, I'll be sure to cover the rest in future episodes. Spreading this out over a few episodes can actually be really valuable, as it gives you time to reflect on each step and send in your questions and thoughts between episodes, which would be wonderful. Some of what I'll cover today may sound familiar, especially since I touched on the initial step in my interview with Lisa in the prior episode. However, I'll be diving into it with more detail this time. So let's get started, okay? You ready? Step number 1, metabolizing the projection. This is a key aspect of containment that involves taking in another's overwhelming emotions. It's about transforming their intense feelings into something less threatening. Remember the hot potato? It's about cooling down that potato and making it easier for them to handle. Now, Let's bring this back to the underlying theory. What leads to helplessness and vulnerability in the first place? These demands stem from deeper unresolved childhood experience of neglect or unmet needs. That's what we said a couple times already. Why am I reminding you of this? Because recognizing this allows us to hold their emotions internally rather than attack, withdraw, or demand. You can now pause and reflect on the emotions behind their demands, creating space for a more thoughtful response. This is where empathy comes in, not just saying you care or offering surface level reassurance, but truly seeking to understand their point of view. It's about more than just saying things like, that must be really painful. It's actively trying to see where they're coming from. Empathy is one of the most powerful ways to help regulate and calm someone. Some say empathy with a narcissist takes years, but my response to that is, not if you do it correctly. I can say much more about this, but let me save that for now so I can get right into a specific example before we begin to wrap up things for this episode. Think of a scenario where either you're putting pressure on someone to tell you what to do, or you, as the helper, feel obligated to step in with a solution and try to make someone feel better. I gave a detailed example of this in the prior episode when a spouse asks you to wake up early and make breakfast for them, but it can be anything. You could fill in the blank here. Anything from small everyday requests to bigger emotional demands that pull on your time and energy. Here's another example. A friend turns to you, emotionally distraught, because perhaps a relationship came to an abrupt end, she's having a major fallout with a mutual friend, or she's overwhelmed by the pressure of work piling up. And again, here, you could fill it in, whatever feels familiar to you. She's crying, constantly overwhelmed, and repeatedly asks you to come over and hang out when she's feeling down or upset, even though you've already spent a lot of time with her recently. She tells you she's struggling emotionally, feeling abandoned, or just needs your company. Though you want to be there for her, it could feel overwhelming to keep putting your own needs aside to meet hers. She might even guilt trip you by saying things like, I don't know what I'd do without you. This friend is typically quite dramatic, often making everything feel urgent and demands a lot of your time and energy. But you have a soft spot for her, right? And you don't want to just withdraw. Remember, we said don't withdraw. However, despite your past efforts to help, and this is the most important part of the story, she often doesn't accept the support you offer, and things never really seem to change. This person in your life keeps coming back with the same emotional needs. Okay, so that's the scenario. In step 1 of containment, we said already that the initial goal is to do what? To metabolize the projection. Instead of reacting by offering a solution right away, remember that's imposing your will, we're trying to make space for those emotions, allowing the person to feel seen and heard without immediately trying to fix things. Our response may look something like this. And by the way, I'm not trying to script you. I don't have the right words for the relationship that you're in with this person, so you can edit this or modify it accordingly. It sounds like you're feeling really overwhelmed right now. This is an example of reflective listening, letting them know that you've heard them and validating their emotions. It's also reassurance, showing that you're engaged and empathic without jumping immediately into problem solving. However, stopping there might not lead to the deeper change you're hoping for. As I mentioned earlier, this kind of empathy alone can take years to make an impact, and often it may never truly shift things. To promote meaningful change, it's crucial to go a step further. You might say something like, I can see how tough things have been for you, but I want to understand why it feels so important for me to, again, you could fill in the blank here. In this example, come over right now. Or the prior example, wake up early and make you breakfast. What's going on for you that makes this the solution? Or you could say, is this the only solution? Right? Is this the only thing you believe will help you feel better? This approach uses questions to dig deeper into her experience, allowing both of you to better understand her emotional state and creating space for more thoughtful dialogue. A containing response should involve gently engaging her curiosity, such as, what's going on? Can you tell me more about why you feel like you need me to come over right now? A little while ago, you were talking about how overwhelmed you feel with everything in your life. But now it seems like you're really focused on needing my company. See, in other words, you see what I'm getting at here? I'm trying to help her, encourage her to begin to consider what's behind that shift. Here, you're helping her recognize how she's moved from reflecting on how things are overwhelming at work, for instance. She was reflecting maybe for a moment on painful emotions, and then she shifted to adopting a more transactional approach where she believes she, and again, I quote literally, because that's the literal mode of interaction that I discussed earlier, that she literally needs your actual care and attention, as if your presence is the only thing that can resolve her emotional problem. Remember, if you step in, take an action, and manage their emotions, it sends an implicit message that they are incapable of doing this themselves. It actually reinforces the sense of helplessness, making it harder for them to process their emotions on their own and undermines their ability to regulate themselves in the future. It may be good for you, by the way. Maybe it sort of boosts your own omnipotence. In other words, that you are the only one who could solve the problem by coming over. That's a whole nother story. We need to get into that in the future as well. In terms of your own emotions, we call this countertransference in my field, or we call it an enactment, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, so let's think of this the other way. Conversely, if you notice that you yourself are making literal or demanding requests of others, asking them to take care of something for you or tell you how to think, it's an opportunity for you to reflect on whether you're outsourcing emotional regulation instead of building the capacity to manage it on your own. Recognizing this pattern in yourself can be the first step toward fostering emotional growth. Now, if you feel like you've been implementing the first step of containment and nothing is changing, it might mean there's a deeper dynamic at play. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help you explore what's getting in the way and work with you to figure out how to create meaningful, lasting change. Okay, as we wrap up today's episode, I want to acknowledge that there's still so much more to cover. We focused on step 1 of containment, exploring how to manage emotional demands without reinforcing helplessness. But there's a lot more to unpack that I will get into in future episodes. If you're finding this information helpful, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any upcoming episodes on this and other topics related to narcissistic traits and relationship dynamics. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the next episodes. Okay, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.